How? By cutting, for instance, subsidies to insurance that make people build irresponsibly in Florida and many other places, better building code, better enforcement of building codes, zoning. There are many, many different ways that we could make the world a much better place. Unfortunately, they're not about cutting carbon emissions. But again, if our goal is to try to help people and actually make a better world, why is it we're not talking about those things first? So my point is, global warming is real, yes. But the current way that we're presenting it actually leads to bad decisions because we're led to believe if we want to deal with heat waves, let's cut carbon emissions. No, if we want to help people not die from heat waves. There are many other ways, make cities cooler, install air conditioning. Those are the kinds of things that will be cheaper and more effective and actually work. Likewise with hurricanes, if we want to help our kids not die from hurricanes, not have huge damage impacts from hurricanes, there are many other ways that we cheaper and more effectively can help them first. That doesn't mean we shouldn't deal with global warming. But it does mean that the current way we do it works very, very poorly. I don't think I need to point that out. But nonetheless, we seem to just be going on like zombies saying, hey, let's try the Kyoto Protocol again. I mean, I thought there was something fundamentally bizarre about how everybody went to Cancun last year and said, all right, we didn't manage in Copenhagen, let's go to Cancun. And everybody was excited that they decided exactly the same thing as what we decided in Copenhagen. It's essentially nothing. And there's a very simple reason for this. Because fundamentally, the current approach, cut carbon emissions now at a fairly high cost, will do virtually no good even 100 years from now. That's a silly way to start. Obviously, the only legally binding thing that we have right now is the Kyoto Protocol. The average of all the macroeconomic models indicate that the cost would be about $180 billion per year, and the net benefit would be a reduction in temperatures so small that nobody could measure this. And of course, remember, we've only implemented about 1/20th of what we promised originally in Kyoto because the US is not there, but also because Europe has transitioned a lot of its emissions to China and elsewhere, and because of a lot of dodgy permits and so on. So fundamentally, we have managed to do even less than this ridiculously small thing that we promised. Yet, we seem to go on in the same track. If we ask, what's the only legal binding treaty on the books right now for 2020, well, that's the EU 2020 policy, reductions of 20% below 1990 levels by 2020. The average of all the macroeconomic models indicate a cost of about $250 billion per year for the rest of the century. So that's about $20 trillion for the US, for Europe. If we spend that $20 trillion, how much do we get? Well, run the models. You show that the impact will be 1/20th of 1 degree centigrade less temperature rise by the end of the century. There's something fundamentally bizarre about talking about spending that much money doing that little good. And of course, if you ask the economists, for every dollar spent, you will avoid a couple of cents, about 3 cents of climate damage. That means you did do some good, but you just didn't do very much good. Couldn't we do it better? And I'll get back to yes, we can. So, but it's important to also emphasize, a lot of people say, and that's obviously the international community, we should promise even more. We should go to a 2 degrees centigrade limit. We should basically promise to do only a 2 degrees centigrade rise in temperatures over pre-industrial temperature. What would that cost? Well, if you run all the macroeconomic models, half of them actually say we can't do it. But the other half, so this is the optimistic half, remember, the optimistic half of the models tell us we could do this. But the cost by the end of the century would be a phenomenal $40,000 billion per year. That's about 13% of global GDP every year to live up to this. And remember, this actually requires everyone to do all the smart things all across the century, all coordinated among all continents. Sounds like a very tall task. It actually shows that if all this is done, the benefit will be for every dollar spent, we'll avoid about 2 cents of climate damage. And of course, remember, if those very, very optimistic assumptions about how politicians will implement this do not hold, the cost could increase 10 to 100-fold. Of course, it couldn't actually increase that much because then that would be more than total GDP, but what it really means is that we'd just be that much less effective and we wouldn't actually reach the 2 degrees centigrade target. So the real point here is to say the current batch of proposals not only not going to happen, but to the extent that they're going to happen, they're going to be phenomenal spends of money at very little benefit. I don't doubt that most of the participants in this conversation want to do good. I'm simply arguing that they're not doing good. So why don't we start talking about, is there another and smarter way forward? And yes, fortunately there is. And if you'll just allow me a brief detour, because I think it's a great metaphor for how the whole conversation has gone astray. If you look at polar bears, in many ways they've become the icon of global warming, I think they're a great way to exemplify how we just don't see the world clearly when we talk about global warming. Polar bears will have an increasing problem with diminishing and eventually disappearing summer Arctic ice. That's absolutely true. There are two things I think many people don't recognize. One is that polar bear population has been increasing dramatically over the last 50 years, so they're not immediately in danger. They're probably quadrupled in global population over the last 50 years. That doesn't mean that there's not a problem. But how do we propose to solve that? Everyone say, cut carbon emissions. Let's just take a look. If everyone had actually managed to do, for instance, the Kyoto Protocol, again, 20 times more than what the world has actually managed to do, and if we managed to do this all the way through the century, how much would that do? Well, the models indicate that we would probably save about 1 polar bear each year. Now, I like polar bears. I would like to save a polar bear, maybe even at a cost of a couple $100 billion. But it strikes me as odd that we don't have a conversation about, if we care about polar bears, why don't we talk about the simple point that every year we shoot polar bears? And not just a few polar bears. Every year, the world shoots somewhere between 300 and 500 polar bears. If we want to help polar bears, why don't we stop shooting 300 polar bears first? Apart from the fact that it would be a couple $100 billion cheaper, it would be better for 299 polar bears. And that's the simple point here. It's not to say, notice, this doesn't solve the problem long term, but we become so obsessed with saying there's only one way to help everything in the world, that's cutting carbon emissions, that we fail to remember that most of the problems in the world we can tackle much better, much cheaper, much more efficiently if we actually focus on solving those. That does not mean we don't need to fix climate change in the long run, but it means we could start thinking about are there other and smarter ways instead of spending $1 and doing a couple of cents of climate benefit. And the answer is yes. I helped organize something called the Copenhagen Consensus on Climate, where we brought together some of the world's top climate economists, 3 Nobel laureates, look at all the ways to fix global warming and cost it and benefit it. You can access all the information on fixtheclimate.com. And it's also out in a book with Cambridge University Press. Fundamentally, they found that the current way to solve global warming is not working. It'll give you, for every $1, a couple of cents of benefits. But there is another way that would dramatically increase research and development into green energy, dramatically increase research and development into green energy technologies. The idea, and they were proposing spend 0.2% of GDP, that would be about $1.6 billion here in Australia. The total benefit from the world would be around $100 billion. It'd be half the cost of Kyoto. It'd be about 50 times more than what the world spends today. The trick here is to recognize that right now we're all trying to make fossil fuel so expensive, nobody wants to buy it. That's politically impossible to do, and it's also economically a bad idea. It's just never going to happen. It may work a little bit in the rich, well-meaning world where we'll cut a little bit, feel very good about it. It'll do nothing to climate change. What we need to do instead is to focus on making green energy so cheap, everyone will buy it. Because if we could make green energy so cheap that it was cheaper than fossil fuels over the next 2 to 4 decades, we'd have solved global warming. Everyone would switch, also the Chinese and the Indians, not because we forced them to, but because the technology was cheaper. And we don't actually invest. Actually, right now, investments have gone down dramatically since the early 80s, and they have not come up while we were talking about the Kyoto Protocol and everything else, because we've been so busy talking about cutting carbon emissions a little that we've failed to remember the only long-term solution is about making green energy so cheap everyone will want it. Now, I don't know if it's going to be solar panels. I think we should be looking at a vast array of different areas. But the beautiful thing is that the estimates indicate that with such a dramatic increase, but remember it's still much, much cheaper than most of the things we're talking about, we could actually fix global warming in the medium term. And the beautiful thing is the economics indicate that for every $1 spent, we would avoid about $11 of climate damage. So instead of spending $1 and avoiding a couple of cents of climate damage, we'd spend $1 and avoid $11 of climate damage. So we can spend less and do much more. Or we can spend actually $100 billion and fix global warming. And the beautiful thing is this is 500 times more effective. This is something we could get everybody going on, and of course that's where I would hope, for instance, the outcome of the conversation on should we have a carbon tax in Australia. It's barking up the wrong tree. It's not that there's something wrong with the carbon tax, but it's simply to recognize that's not what's going to solve the problem. Focus on making investment in green energy research and development, make green energy cheaper, because that way we could get everybody to eventually cut dramatically. I promised 4 points, and I will shut up very quickly. My fourth point is really just, and that's what the rest of my Copenhagen Consensus Center does, is to recognize that there are many other, and in many ways, more important problems in the world. I think, you know, in a world where half the world's population lack clean drinking water, sanitation, basic health care, education, food, it's very obvious that for those people, global warming, worries about temperature rises in 100 years is just not the most important issue. It doesn't mean we're not a rich world and we can tackle more issues, but I find it somewhat discouraging that we're so focused on global warming and forget all the other issues in the world. Al Gore talks about global warming as our generational mission, and I think a lot of other people have made the same sort of statements. He says, how do you want to be remembered by your kids and grandkids? I think that's the exact right question. Al Gore and everybody else says, how do you want to be remembered by your kids and grandkids? I'm just astounded by so many well-meaning people that I know want to be remembered for spending hundreds of billions of dollars every year to do virtually no good 100 years from now. I just do not believe that our kids and grandkids are going to say, great going there, Granddad, when we could have done so much more good. If you look at the evidence from the UN, they actually estimate that for about $75 billion, for less than half the amount of spending just in Kyoto, we could solve all major basic problems. We could give clean drinking water, sanitation, basic health care, and education to every single human being on the planet. How do you want to be remembered? Spending twice as much money doing no good 100 years from now, or half that amount of money and fix all problems today? That is the very stark choice that we're faced with. This does not mean we shouldn't also focus on investing in green energy, but let's just remember, if we want to be remembered well in this world, wow, that's never a good sign. But anyway, the fundamental point is to recognize that yes, we do need to fix global warming, but please let's fix it effectively. And then, of course, also remember, if we want to be remembered well, there are lots of other issues we need to fix first. So those are the 20 or 25 minutes. Thank you very much.